It is a strange time. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's 2:30 on Monday, July 31st. This is the Flagler County Board of County Commissioners Workshop. Today, we're going to be discussing the Stormwater Master Plan. If you'd all please rise and join me in the saluting our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And as we always do, we're going to have a moment of silence. I encourage you to think about all the good things you have in your life and all the really wonderful things you have to look forward to. And our first responders, our firemen, our deputy sheriffs, our EMTs, and our men and women serving our nation around the country. Please join me for a minute. Thank you. We have a sad announcement. I'll let Mr. Sullivan, would you?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a sad note, and that is I heard this morning that our longtime person who was on the board with us, with a lot of us, not all of us, but three of us at least, Charlie Erickson, who you may know him from the past, passed away this morning in the Orlando area. Rosemary, his longtime close friend, called me, and he passed away peacefully. And he was a good man, did a lot of good for the county, and was on the as a commissioner for 4 years, up until I guess Andy, you are in his place. So it's a sad note, but he's gone on now, and I have the information. If we want to send a note or anything, I can give that to you. But that's the announcement.
Thank you, David. As I said, welcome. Today we're going to look at the Stormwater Master Plan, our first look at it.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Flagler County Stormwater Master Plan Workshop. My name is Richard Zion. I'm with Flagler County Engineering. I'm accompanied today by our consultant who helped us prepare the preliminary plan, Mr. Mark Eller with Geosyntec Consultants. A little bit of a background from where we started to where we've gotten to now. We officially kicked off the project in January of 2022 and have worked diligently to undergo some intensive data gathering, analysis, coordination with our local stakeholders, other cities that are local, Bunnell, Palm Coast, City of Flagler Beach. We reached out to our public, held a couple of public meetings in different locations, and have been working with them directly to get feedback over the last year or so to see about finding the locations that are concerning throughout the county, looking at issues that we're identifying throughout this evaluation, and trying to come up with solutions to help address some of these issues and some of the other aspects of the project. We're going to explore during this presentation and dive into some of those details. We wanted to hold the workshop today so that we could take a deeper dive into some of these items since we've gotten the project to this point so that you all can take a minute, look through it. If you have any questions, we can have some interaction and go through it at this time. Following the workshop this afternoon, we also have a final public meeting so that we can get more and final public information from the folks, the residents throughout the county, give them another opportunity. We're going to post online a survey for them to complete a comment form, which we also have a hard copy here as well, so that we can get any information from them to help us tie the project up so that we can put together the best product to address the needs of the county. Unless you all have any questions to begin with, I'm going to turn it over to our consultant this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I'll jump right in. Commission, thank you for having me today to tell our story about the Stormwater Master Plan that we've been working on for quite a while here in the last year and a half or so. I'm Mark Ellard. I'm a senior principal with Geosyntec Consultants and the project manager. So, I'm leading the project from its inception. What we're going to do, or our goal for this meeting, is to provide an update on the project, give you an overview of what we've been doing, what's going on, what was the scope of work that we worked through, and also the recommendations that are now, upon us here towards the end of the project, and give an idea of the schedule where we go from here. We're at the end, kind of trains coming into the station, so to speak. So we'll let you know what's coming up next. But it's a little bit of background. We talk about stormwater master plan and what that is. First off is, why is this important? Well, it's important because, first and foremost, Flagler County is a great place to be. It's a destination county. You want people to come live here, people to visit. There's a quality of life for residents that's important, recreation, tourism, those things which are great. And issues with stormwater management that come up with municipalities have to deal with. Flood risk is one. Here's some pictures from some flooding on the coastal areas from one of the recent storms. Some things that are fresh in folks' mind now. Flood risk, but there's also issues of water quality. Now, luckily, this picture here is from your neighbors to the south. It's not anywhere in Flagler County, but it exemplifies the need to make sure that water resources and some of these water impairments that are talked about, are addressed, and so that the water quality, the surface water quality, can meet its intended use and the benefit for everybody. So it's very important that the effective stormwater management plan guides the stormwater program, reduces flood risk, improves water quality, but also proactively prevents infrastructure problems. And by that, we'll talk a bit about that. There's a lot of infrastructure that the county needs to maintain. So the idea of being proactive, trying to fix it and maintain it before it becomes a more expensive problem is a great task and goal for the project. And also the idea of planning things out to be fiscally responsible, get the most bang for the buck on what's being spent with regard to stormwater management. And lastly, there's this idea of sustainability and resiliency. And those are terms that are thrown out a lot lately. We'll talk a little bit about them. But how this master plan can help provide a sustainable environment for the future for Flagler County. And also this idea of resiliency things. If things change or however in the future, how the county can cope and deal with that and, bounce back even more successfully. So that's kind of the importance of there. So when we talk about why we need the plan, there's several items, and there's a lot of stuff on the slide, but I'll go through and you'll see a common theme. One is we need a plan because the county operates and maintains a stormwater system. There's things that need to be maintained, kept up, that treat and convey stormwater to meet the flooding, the water quality issues. And those can be public health, safety, and welfare issues as well. Obviously, flooding is the thing we see. We don't want to see people flooded, having to leave their homes, but also poor water quality can have an impact as well. Because of the age of a lot of infrastructure, there's this idea of age and diminished capacity of the system. Some of the infrastructure can be reaching its service life, needs to be replaced. But how do you know that? You have to have good inspection and maintenance program to be able to identify those areas. And also look at what needs to be modernized. In the last few decades, with regard to stormwater management, there's been a lot of enhancement of the way stormwater management is done, facilities, types of equipment, and installations. So there's some modernization that can put the county in a better position. And there's also this idea back to resiliency, which I mentioned with. There's projections of things like we hear about sea level rise or other climate changes that if those projections hold and go through, there's going to be a stress on that stormwater infrastructure that may need to be addressed through planning and maybe doing things a bit different. Now, this is a key component, and the timing of which kind of matched the kickoff of the Stormwater Master Plan is the county is becoming a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDS, permittee, and sort of the Municipal Separate Stormwater Sewer System program that comes down from EPA, and it comes down through the DEP and is administered. So municipalities of a certain size are required to come into the umbrella of the NPDS program. What that means is guidelines dictated by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection of minimum standards for a stormwater program. And that's not simply just, hey, you need to address flooding and water quality, but also how you maintain your system, your O&M, and your record keeping and things. We'll talk a bit more about that in the presentation. With regard to floodplains, there's also this idea of getting ahead on the risk from floodplains that have been delineated by FEMA. As you well know, FEMA establishes the maps for flood insurance purposes. But there's the National Flood Insurance Program Community Rating System. That's a program out there that municipalities can be part of that provides a discount to residents for their flood insurance based on how well the municipality meets certain criteria. Stormwater Master Plan is certainly one of those criteria that's looked at. And the last big thing about why we need the plan is to provide prioritization of what funding you'll get the most bang for the buck being spent on. So organizing that, having a good plan moving forward. So with that foundation, we put together a scope of work to hit all of these areas. Now you see in this graphic on the right, stormwater management program has a lot of different elements. The flooding that we see the most of, but water quality. But this idea of operations and maintenance, but also regulatory compliance and regulations that need to be met, and also the idea of resilience. So this list on the left are the different scope items, the different categories of things we went stepwise through to develop data, assess the current state of the program. And I'm going to talk about each one of these briefly to give you a sense of what we looked at and what we're seeing. Now, the first and foremost foundation of it is just to understand the stormwater characteristics of the county. And this is what we say. Now, these are some kind of complicated graphics here, but they point out some of the key bits of information that affect stormwater runoff, the volume and the rate. Here on the left is topography, or the elevation of the land surface. As many of you are familiar with, Flagler County is very dynamic. On this map, you see areas in white that are higher in elevation, and then the dark reds, but then lower in elevation are some of the lighter greens and the blue you can see over, of course, by Crescent Lake and by the intercoastal. So we were fortunate enough at the beginning of this project to have new statewide from the USGS LIDAR topography data to be able to do our assessment on, which is a great boon to this. Again, that influences the rate and storage of stormwater runoff. Soil types is another important factor that we look at very closely. It's the ability, when rainfall happens, soil absorbs a certain amount of that rainfall before runoff happens, before we then have to manage the runoff. So depending on the soil types, more runoff may happen in a certain area. One example is a deep water table. Sandy soils tend to absorb a lot more rain and rainfall before runoff occurs, whereas your low, maybe mucky soils and depressional areas, runoff maybe happen instantaneously. So the rainfall infiltration and percolation capacity is important. The land use is also critical to stormwater management. And when we talk about land use, we're really talking about the degree of imperviousness of our developments. And the imperviousness, of course, is the hard surfaces, the roads, the buildings, the sidewalks, all the pavement that don't allow infiltration of stormwater. And in order to mitigate that, we create stormwater management facilities to store and treat that. You can see here on this map some of the areas in red are some of the more urban or developed areas in the county, which may tend to have a higher impervious area. But as you can see, some of the light green and blue areas, that's a lot where the kind of the low-lying, the wetlands, and some of the lakes are, and brown areas and agricultural. So again, very, very diverse, but an important driver. So these things create kind of a foundational theme as we're looking and assessing the county and how well stormwater management may need to be done and programmed for and planned for. Floodplains is another key aspect, as I mentioned before. Kind of depicts flood risk throughout the county that's established by FEMA. This map here on the right shows what's delineated by FEMA in the most recent mapping update, which is 2018, pretty recent. Interesting to note, the darker blue areas are areas that have base flood elevations established, and that's important because if you go build your home, you know what elevation to build above or a road or whatnot. But a lot of the areas, and arguably some of the more rural areas, have just approximate floodplains. So there's a flood risk associated with there, but maybe a little difficult to tease out an elevation. But nevertheless, these are used for flood insurance purposes, so it's a big deal because people have to pay for flood insurance based on the accuracy of these maps. Now, they reflect major conveyances and water bodies, as again, you can see the intercoastal and Crescent Lake here on the west. And really, what we looked at during the master plan was an idea of look at these areas, do they make sense, and is there potentially some recommendations for the county to look into some of these areas in a little bit more detail from a flooding standpoint, potentially recommend looking at engaging in some updates to floodplains in the future. Another part of the foundational data review portion was really to dig into a regulatory review part. So we looked at the code and development review. So these elements are important to know what's going on and what governs not only the regulations and code for development, but even retrofitting different stormwater management facilities. So we looked at the comp plan, land development code. Internally, we also looked at what the regulations St. John's Water Management District has in the county and dictates, even DOT. And this review really focused on some issues, some concurrency issues. Do these all line up with each other? Do they match? Do they complement each other well? Is there any inconsistencies between them? And then maybe that's a recommendation for changing some wording, but also looking for enhancements needed. Some of these, the code and elements and wording may have persisted for quite a while. Maybe there's some changes in the way the industry does or management or regulations may need to be.
Are you talking with the firm that's writing our comp plan now?
Yes, there's currently a firm that is updating the comp plan, and earlier on in the project, we did have some coordination with that effort, but it was, I think, early on in their effort. But so the recommendations that we would have under this may complement what they're doing.
Okay.
So what maybe need to be enhanced? There's other things. There's potentially a new stormwater quality rule that may get approved by the legislature next year that may dictate some changes in the way stormwater quality treatment is done. But all these things were looked at to provide some recommendations on some enhancements for the county to consider. Now, I mentioned the NPDES permit. Again, this was a state program come through and can guide a regulatory kind of a guide or framework for stormwater management programs that now the county will be responsible for responding to. Now, there's a lot of particular requirements of just providing a framework for a stormwater management program. So, for example, what things that they're looking at and elements of these permits that many of which the county is already in one shape or form doing, but wanting to be more specific with things like public education and involvement, illicit discharge detection and elimination, making sure that bad things aren't getting into the surface water, storm waterways, inspecting construction sites, making sure there's not erosion that's impacting off-site, post-construction stormwater management, the idea that once you build things, you still need to make sure that they're operating down the road, and some other internal pollution prevention good housekeeping recommendations, standard operating procedures for staff to manage the O&M parts of it. So there's also some very specific things related to water quality, and some of the, we'll talk a little bit about water quality in a minute, but some of the regulations that are coming down that will dictate some action on the part of the county to address impaired waters are also supported under this permit. So, for example, addressing TMDLs, which is total maximum daily loads, which is a regulatory target for improving surface water quality. Now, we did submit as required, help develop and provided a Richard submitted back in August 2022 the notice of intent, which is the initial document to get into them to meet their requirements. And we are, as of the state, still waiting on DEP to respond to any comments on that program. So the timing of that was good with the outset of this master plan that we're able to address this very easily with a lot of the data we're already looking at. Now, we shift here to our review of operations and maintenance. And so what this is really focused on is there's a lot of infrastructure the county needs to maintain on a day-in, day-out basis. There's a responsibility to do it with staff and equipment resources. So on this map on the right is what we've teased out some information on what is that, the items that have to be maintained. The blue lines that you can see there are canals that are county maintained. So they need to be free of debris, clear of erosion issues and flowing freely. The light green lines are county maintained roads. Some of them are small local roads, some of them are larger roads. And then along those facilities, there's a lot of drainage inlets, drainage pipes, and stormwater infrastructure that all needs to be maintained and responsible by the county. So with this maintenance review evaluation and the opportunity to look at what needs to be maintained and what are the resources, equipment, and personnel that we need to be applied to this to make the program, as I mentioned before, more proactive and less reactive. These things include inspection, routine maintenance, replacement frequencies of certain infrastructure. And the idea is to probably quantify what that need is, and that can be put forth in the master plan for planning purposes, for hey, this is potentially the equipment and the staffing you may need to move forward and be more proactive to maintain. Now, as part of that O&M evaluation is you have to know details about the infrastructure that's being maintained. So one other portion of the scope was a detailed drainage infrastructure inventory. This is really just building upon what the county had started and trying to map out every drainage inlet and pipe throughout the county. even some areas that the county doesn't necessarily maintain because stormwater doesn't know the city limits. It just passes through from infrastructure to infrastructure. So this map on the right, you see a lot of that. It's real busy because there's just a lot of infrastructure. Orange lines are different canals or natural conveyances, but red dots are bridge locations, and blue dots structures and pipes and things. So there is quite a bit that needs to be addressed. In fact, over 10,000 structures and over 5,000 pipes were captured in this data set. And this is great because it allows the folks through the GIS department and folks, Richard, to have more information about where things are to be able to predict and addressing issues, but also planning for the future. So this information helps not only inventory or drainage assets, but develop, as I mentioned, more proactive maintenance strategies, knowing where things are and where they may fail, potentially the age of them helps you get out in front of them, which then better identification of equipment and resources. Now, one thing I will mention that we also looked at and some recommendations were the issue of easements. In order to maintain drainage infrastructure, pipes and canals, the county needs to have legal access to be able to go on that property. There's a lot of right-of-way beside the roads, so that's maybe easy sometimes, but some of the canals or some of the things which extend or get onto private property a little bit, if there's not an easement there or legal access, then it can be difficult to maintain those. And because most everything is interconnected, that can cause some challenges. So there were some recommendations to look hard at the needs for easements in certain areas where the county may not have them currently. Now, this data was also used as a foundation to move through some assessment portions, flooding and water quality and a little bit of resiliency. So first, on the flood assessment, what we're really looking for is, from a planning standpoint, is to identify flood-prone areas or areas that are potentially not meeting a design level of service. And one of the big tools we use is hydrologic and hydraulic models, basically computer simulations that tie together all the drainage infrastructure, all the channels, the pipes, the ponds, the storage areas, and evaluate the hydraulics of it to evaluate what this design level service is, whether stuff seems to be passing or seems to be failing. So in this, we use this tool, we put it together kind of on a regional basis, but with a focus on primary county-maintained infrastructure, and identified some of these key structures, what they should be performing as. For example, on a local road in a subdivision, you generally establish that a culvert cross drain under a road needs to convey a 10-year design storm. And that's a certain rainfall volume, and not flood the road. Whereas other more important facilities like a bridge or some facility near an evacuation route, it's all the way up to a 100-year design storm. So it needs to perform to a certain level. So we're going to pick those out and use this modeling tool to start identifying areas that may be potential flood deficiency areas, and use that as part of the information, part of the picture to program potential flood improvement projects that may see warranted. And this ties in back to just infrastructure deficiencies, the primary or secondary infrastructure where we're present, looking at how well things perform and start to do that. Now, we did get input from the county staff and input from the public during the public meetings we had to be able to zero in on a few areas that have had a lot of complaints, had a lot of observations of flooding, and were able to provide a little bit more detail and look into those areas a little bit harder during this process. But this is one key component to identifying projects and needs for a capital improvement program. Now, water quality was another area. Now, this map on the right shows the different impaired waters or different contributing areas to those impaired waters in the county. You see the dashed yellow line around there, that's the county boundary. And what you see is a lot, almost. Not unlike other places in Florida. Nearly all the waters are designated impaired. Now, what does that mean? It just means it's not 100% clean as the way the state would like it per the standards as far as recreational use or meeting its designated use. And usually the predominant impact to most of the waters in Florida, particularly in Flagler County, are just nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, which are naturally occurring. So it's just the imbalance of those is causing issues. However, there are some waters been identified with dissolved oxygen or bacteria or even metals, issues throughout the county. Now, so looking at this and looking where these are, we start to be able to look at, well, some of these impaired waters, what can potentially be done as far as improving water quality in the areas that contribute to it, because stormwater is one of the primary contributors to surface waters and streams in those areas. So this helps us to start targeting, areas that may warrant some water quality treatment to start meeting this goal. Now, there's a lot of older areas in the county that were developed or built decades ago before there was the modern stormwater management regulations, and those are, certainly areas. Most of the newer areas, as you can see, newer subdivisions, they have stormwater management ponds that help with flooding and water quality and all these, areas. So a lot of the newer areas are pretty up to standard. There's also some lot of, other, suburban or rural areas that, again, don't have treatment, and those can be targets. And as I mentioned before, this is one of the requirements to look at this and come up with a plan as part of the requirements of the NPDES permit as well. So another category of issues and things to look at as far as identifying potential capital improvement projects. Now here we shift gears to resilient strategies. And as I mentioned, this is a word that's used a lot lately. There's a lot of talk about what, future conditions may be changing. So again, as I mentioned before, if projections hold, sea level rise happens or continues to happen, rainfall patterns change, the way that stormwater is managed, particularly in coastal areas, may change, and maybe some of the areas the drainage might not work or be as effective anymore, depending on the case. So this was an opportunity to do a cursory assessment of the drainage infrastructure they delineated, and I will note, I think there's a larger, more detailed assessment going on of Flagler County outside of what we're doing. But a quick look at the infrastructure, looking at public available information to see under certain circumstances what infrastructure may be impacted. So if you look at these maps, the one on the left just shows the county, a lot of dense red dots where this stormwater infrastructure is, again, inlets, pipes, et cetera. And then there's a zoom in there on the right, which shows an area out by the coast, and the light blue areas are what was based on inundation elevations from some flood surge from hurricanes and some different elevation sources, what could likely be inundated. So for this example is a Category 1 surge, Category 1 hurricane. Available information to kind of flood the land surface, so to speak, and identify where are the infrastructure that could be vulnerable. Now what this can tell us is, from a planning standpoint, is if there's redevelopment or development or retrofits in that area, maybe these areas could be candidates for a little bit more higher level of service based on some of these projections. Or maybe some other information about how to manage these coastal areas from either a development standpoint, where there is development still happening, and other issues. So these resiliency strategies, we're kind of flavored in some of the other recommendations. There's flooding and water quality and some of the infrastructure things to, again, support some of these capital improvement recommendations. So, I mentioned a lot about the capital improvement recommendations. So, taking all the individual components and wrapping them together, what do we recommend as far as what needs to be done under the next 10 years of a stormwater program? And that's 10 years is the planning horizon that we're looking at. So, what we had is we wanted to do a couple things. First is identify what we call a long list of about 60 projects. These are project ideas. It makes sense to address flooding, water quality, or potentially both, or address large areas that need infrastructure upgrades. And look at what makes sense as far as a long-term planning list, well beyond the 10-year initial horizon. And we did kind of look at what projects are currently on the books by the county. There's a number of things going on as well that impact some of these. So there's a long list, but what we focused on here under this particular plan is a ranked short list of about 20 detailed conceptualized projects. And what this was the opportunity to take these 20 projects, top 20, if you will, and provide the extra bit of information to look at how they can be implemented. First, look at whether they're implementable. I'll look through a number of criteria like constructability. Is there any major pitfalls? What we don't want to do is recommend projects that you can't implement. We've maybe all been through the process of you get a great project idea and it gets down the road and you figure out, well, for whatever reason it can't be implemented. Well, you want to head that off right away. So we look at constructability, land acquisition challenges, whether that's property acquisition or easements, permittability. We are talking to the Water Management District about making sure projects can be permitted. Some coordination with the local municipalities may be needed. But again, looking at 20 areas that can be conceptualized to the degree which we can approximate some costs of implementation costs. And by implementation cost, meaning not only the construction costs, but an idea of property acquisition, easements, but also design, permitting, construction oversight, and with a contingency, recognizing market costs are very volatile these days, and provide them as part of the plan to be programmed and looked at this first, next 10 years. So let's look at where these locations are. Oh, yeah.
Chairman, just on that last slide, where it says costs, approximately 32 million plus, does that include both the unincorporated and the municipalities?
So what we did with our projects is we were focused on unincorporated areas, so just the county.
The 32 million refers to the unincorporated?
Yes. And now there are some projects, getting into the details, that because, again, stormwater doesn't stop at jurisdictional lines, there may be some impact or benefit or, cross collaboration with them, but it is intended to be focused on unincorporated. And this 32 million here is the rough construction cost. That's estimated right now, preliminary estimate. So when we look at where these are, there's a couple things to note. So in red here, with the numbers identified, are the top 20 in red. And we have on yellow here the lower rank, the other 40 approximately, just to you can get a sense for where they are. They're spread fairly well throughout the county, so there's a geographical distribution that we're shooting for. You do see a large concentration there around the Daytona North area, because there's a lot of development, a lot of things there, and a lot of water quality concerns over there. So that's where they are geographically. And on this next slide is the list, which is included in the plan of of the names of these projects and where they're located. Now, a couple things to note here is there's several options or project areas that may have alternatives, particularly where you're looking at particularly a water quality facility. They may have property acquisition and provide some alternatives for property. So for example, there's 3 sevens, that's just alternatives, but only one of them would be implemented. But going through the list, you see there's flooding, infrastructure conveyance, flooding and water quality, infrastructure conveyance, a mix of different projects in this. Now, all told, this totals about 40 plus million. Now, why that's different than the last slide is it includes construction and some property acquisition, it includes construction, property acquisition, but design and permitting, so a little different. So, the extra 8 million is fairly significant. So that's the take home and the recommendations that we have now. And then just to give you a sense of what some of these look like, here's a little bit of some busy maps, but here's some projects recommended for the Old Hawk Creek Road area. On the left, you see an aerial basin and a few things. There's couple different projects recommended here. In the middle, you see the white dashed line that's in there. Recommended there is some infrastructure improvements. Really going through along the road, there's been some flooding areas near to the canal and the outfalls towards the center of that, but trying to be very consistent with the infrastructure that may over time have been installed piecemeal, different sizes and everything, being real specific about that, make it easier to maintain. But also what you see on here is because this main canal that goes through the center of it, east to west, is a contributor to Black Creek, Black Branch, that contributes to Hall Creek, again, impaired waters. The idea is these potentially some areas that may be opportunistic for acquiring some property to put some type of water quality treatment facility, again, to take the edge off of some of those requirements. Now, you do see in here that there's 5 areas labeled 5. Again, that's because there's alternate locations. Either any one of the 3 may be just as effective depending on what will go forward. So if this moves forward, just one of those would be selected. Now, on the right side is just the exact same area, but just showing the topography. This is the topography map. And again, if you remember from the previous slide, white is very higher in elevation, red is still dark red, higher in elevation, and you get down to the blue and the light blue and the greens, that's lower. So I put this in there really just to understand it's very complicated. It's not just all downhill, in Flagler County and some of these areas. There's a lot of depressional areas and ditches and channeling that goes on, which makes it particularly a challenge when you're looking at projects.
Am I looking at that correctly, that you want to put ponds where the highest elevation is?
Where there, if you look, the key part of the proximity of the ponds is adjacent to the canal, the blue line, and getting the ability to be able to utilize some of the upland area to be able to route water through, get some treatment before it is, sent back into the canal is what we're looking at. So yeah, there is some higher areas. One of the challenges we have with doing, say, a water quality facility is you generally just can't. You'd think you could buy wetlands and just buy wetlands and do that, but the Water Management District is very sensitive about using natural wetlands for a water quality treatment facility. They prefer new area be used. So that's why you see some of the areas intersecting some of the upland areas to be able to part of the route. But those would be dug down into more of a pond situation, so it would allow that flow through to come out. Now, this next example, Daytona North area, there's numerous things recommended here. As you remember in the map, this is divided into 5 infrastructure improvement projects, linear improvement, 7 flood and water quality projects, 2 water quality pond opportunities, and a lot of addressing grading and consistent infrastructure. There's already some projects going on here in this area, some road paving and other things which are helping chip away at some of the problems. If you look at the map on the right, you see several things. Some of the linear areas along the Firecracker Canal, which is on the south side, and Canal Avenue on the north, and some infrastructure improvements, making sure things flow effectively through there. On the west side is the Water Oak Canal that, again, is a main outfall for this area. And there's also in green here and shading in the bottom left, you see some potential sites for water quality opportunities. Again, catching water before it's getting into those impaired waters to do some treatment, similar to what we talked about in the previous slide. And then also there's some call outs, if you look at the upper right, about, again, obtaining easements, as we mentioned, which is a challenge, being able to have county have legal access to maintain these facilities. So a little bit of everything in that area. And again, on the right is, again, just the topographical map, again, indicating that things are a little bit of a challenge. In this particular case, there's low areas on both the east and the west a little bit, so there is this challenge of the water trying to make its way eventually to get to the west, southwest to Crescent Lake eventually. Those are a couple snapshots of a flavor of some of the projects that were conceptualized. Now, with that list, one of the other opportunities we had in the master plan was look through a funding evaluation. So the county has limited funds, as most municipalities have. So what are the options and opportunities out there for funding? So kind of an idea, a brainstorm on here's some options, some of them very specific and maybe timely. You've had good success partnering with the DOT in the past with projects, but there's grants from the DEP, particularly some of the resiliency grants that are out there right now, which have a wide target of being able to address flooding, water quality, and in addition to any resiliency flavor there. The Water Management District has some programs, and also there's legislative appropriations that can be used as well, potentially. So in the report, providing a menu or a list of ideas of how the external funding can be helped to get the county where it needs to go. So that was a snapshot of the technical issues. I do like to reiterate, as Richard mentioned, that we did have contacts with the public during the process. This is a picture here in this room. We had a public meeting back in February 22nd, and then a companion meeting out in the Hidden Trails Community Center about a week later or so. Introduce the project to citizens, present the scope, but really solicit input on flooding and other things. And we did get a lot of input, probably 25 or 30 comment forms that we got back in with some information that was helpful during the process. So that was good. We captured that and documented that. Now, fast forward to today, we're having our final public meeting this evening here at 5:30. Yeah, 5:30, 7:30 here in this room. And then, of course, we have this meeting here, this workshop that we're meeting with you today to present the recommendations. And then at the end, when we have everything wrapped up, we will come back and present a final kind of a capstone presentation to you, targeted sometime in the September, October timeframe. So what are the next steps to completion? We have the draft master plan submitted. It's under review. The county staff, we have the meetings that are today, public meeting and this workshop. We're targeting a draft final, depending on how many comments and input and everything we need to flavor into the master plan, really targeting the end of August. Get the draft final master plan. That's one more opportunity for staff to review and comment, make sure everything's on the same page, and then issue a final report September, October, and then that meeting, as I mentioned, back with you September, October. This is just how it looks like on a project schedule basis, and starting back in January 2022, we've come a long way to here where we have the current project milestones, the stars here, and then wrapping up here very soon for the next two and a half months. Now, last little item is what's next after the master plan. So the master plan is completed, it's done. We hope that it doesn't just sit on the shelf. It actually is used, provides good input for the county, good ideas to move forward, but provide the basis for information to start identifying capital or funding for capital projects, certainly, grants, other external funding sources. Capital projects, now once they start moving forward, just a reminder that they will involve the following steps. We've conceptualized and provided some details, some preliminary costs, but they will require some feasibility analysis, final design and permitting. That may take anywhere from 9 to 12, 24 months, depending on the complexity of the project. And then construction. So some of these is a long lead time to get to the dirt turning and then the construction. But the timeline we put forth and put in the master plan was these projects, the top 10-year completion time frame. One other important recommendation we do is to make this a living document, a living effort. So a strong recommendation to master plan should be revisited every 5 years, either by staff or a consultant, to reassess the priorities. Things don't always work exactly towards plans, so this idea you can refresh, reorganize, and keep things moving forward with that specific plan. And with that, that is the content I have to share with you, and I thank you for the time, and I would be glad to answer any questions or elaborate on anything that we have in there.
Commissioners? Ms. Sullivan?
Just a general comment, and this is being selfish on my part. I live in Grand Haven, and Grand Haven's was built 25 to 30 years ago, and they did a hell of a job, I think, on stormwater there. They have underground utilities, and they have a pond system that's regulated with levels and so forth. So I guess my point is, there's an example of where it was done pretty well a number of years ago, and it's held up through all the storms we've had and everything. So I just say it can be done. It's expensive to go back and try to retrofit, but and there are a couple other areas in the county that have been done well, and maybe can be used as examples of what it takes, to actually put a system in impact that works.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point, because a lot of times we'll do these plans and it focuses on the negative, the what's wrong. But there certainly is a lot right that has been done, particularly in more recent years where engineers, I'm an engineer, so I can talk about my profession, where engineers are more savvy about doing things right, as you mentioned. So there are a lot of new developments that do operate, thank goodness, fairly well.
But I appreciate it. It's a big job, I guess, is my point. And the other point I was going to make was that it looks like there's not going to be a lot we can do for our coming budget year, because this is wrapping up right at the time the new fiscal year will start, October 1st. So, I guess that's okay, because it takes a while to put together a plan. We don't have a lot of extra money anyway. But I just say, maybe Heidi can answer that, is it doesn't look like we'll be able to do specific implementation of these projects in the coming year. I don't know, I'm just asking.
Yeah, and we did have what we provided in the report, and and it was, fairly busy and here is took those, the costs with those top 20 projects and kind of spread them out through a 10-year kind of expenditure matrix, recognizing that, design and permitting may happen 1 year, then maybe property acquisition, then construction, maybe over 1 to 2 years, to kind of spread it out to give a first kind of taste of how it may be implemented over that time period. But it is be a long-term process.
Ms. Pennington?
When you brought up the Old Hawk Creek, do you have an individual, like, dollar amount for each project, kind of a baseline for each of those?
Yeah, what we, and we did zip through this real quick. So, the list of projects, yes, there is a individual dollar amount and a more detailed cost breakout for each of these projects that's included in the report, yes.
Because the one thing that he mentioned was that you could ask for legislative appropriations is one of the ideas, but the Old Hog Creek, is that not where our state project may be going? The larger state project? Guard? Same area. So I'm wondering if there's, since he has a dollar amount for the project, if it would be something to entertain, to help out in there.
To include it in the project.
Or either to include it in the project or to help us get a funding to start there in that area on the stormwater.
Yeah, I would say, so what we're looking at before as far as the project target area was a bit downstream of the jail area.
Okay.
But that's a good point. We can
It's
kind of
kind of,
relook
that
at.
road goes all the way to like State Road 11, I think.
So, yeah.
So, yeah, because they can go out either way when they're there.
Mr. O'Brien?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. A few things. What was the engagement from the agricultural community and our larger landowners in your process here? Because it's real integral to, to the whole, this whole planning and, the impacts here. So just curious what that entailed and what did you do?
Yeah, for our scope, I would say there wasn't any specific targeted towards that community, but as part of the overall public engagement, it was open to all those groups, but there was not a target to just that audience specifically.
So, again, it's kind of fast and haven't had a chance to really soak this all in, but I'm assuming some of the drainage projects along some of those roadways are all roadways that are contiguous with the large farming, the large agricultural lands that we have.
Some of them may be, for example, Canal Avenue. There's a project that recommends some infrastructure upgrades, and that is next to, off the top of my head, some large agricultural parcels, and I think there's some other ones.
Is there a way over time that staff could, working with you, give us, you had that list of 5 or 6 ways that we could fund this over time. Is there any way you could give us a sense of scale of what we might be able to go after from each one of those buckets, FDOT, DEP, the grants? I have, this is not my area of expertise, but it would help me to understand,
Yeah.
What the potentials are. And also, I would say to my fellow commissioners, maybe we should, if we can get this prioritized, maybe in September, October, it still gives us time to put in some legislative asks, which really this is going to be our last year to have a major look at what we're asking for this year because of the position we're in with our, with the Speaker of the House being his district and also an influential state senator, senior state senator. So if we can sneak any of this in now, I think we should look to do that if we can. And then I also just wanted to say, all 5 of us live within the city boundaries of Palm Coast, and we're all, except for Mr. Sullivan, who lives in Grand Haven, which is, as you say, a very well-designed community. We all deal with and see the impact of an older stormwater system in the city. And one of the things that really just hit me between the eyes actually just this weekend is looking at my neighborhood and how much it flooded because of the heavy storms we got in the northern part of the county. That system is so dependent upon individual property owners keeping up just the culverts and the flow underneath their driveways, to the extent that we can think about designing projects here that are not dependent on individual landowners having to, impact the system, that's taken out of the equation, I think is real important for us to think about.
Yeah, I would respond to a couple things. In our report is details on the funding, kind of the characterization of the different types of funding. But that's an interesting question you have about how deep is their pockets on each one of these little things. So we can look back and try to tease that out a little bit more, because you are normally, when going after grants, it's a competition, with other counties and municipalities. So if you don't feel like you have a good chance because there's a small bucket on one, put all your efforts in another bucket. So that's a good point. I appreciate that. And just to follow up on your idea of the private infrastructure and people maintaining, yeah, that is absolutely a challenge. Particularly when I was talking earlier about easements, there's a challenge on a larger basis. But even in the subdivision, the more rural style homes or subdivision has swales, and you're kind of counting everybody to maintain their little driveway culvert to make things continually flow. And not everybody's educated about how the systems work and should be work and maintained, which is a challenge, which could be part of a public education program. But yeah, it does work together. And sometimes there's a point that may come where it's more beneficial for the municipality to kind of take it over to ensure the greater good if there is problems in individual areas with that. So that's a great point.
Mr. Dance.
Thank you, sir. To Commissioner O'Brien's comments on the funding, I think the first major step in securing future fundings was this plan itself. So a lot of them will require the master, even before we can go apply for some of these, they're going to require this study. So this
Right, that
was,
we have one.
exactly.
Right.
And I think even some of the appropriations we received for preserving some of our natural areas go a long way in protecting some of these basins and water flow areas. Obviously, we don't have our review of the plan yet, but the interesting thing, I love this graphic with the county. It goes to show how water is integral, not just on the beach side or on the edges of the lakes, but throughout the entire county. I think, our quality of life is so dependent upon these water bodies and their canals, their streams, their marshes. They're not just the ones that we think of. And we've got some really high-quality ones, Pellisier Creek on the north, Bulow Creek. Do you go into in the plan and talk about, a lot of those were overlaid with the impaired areas. So do you talk about how, I think one about how we can correct some of the impurities, but also on these high-quality areas that are threatened by development, do you give any strategies on how we can further protect those edges?
Yeah, so there's a couple things. In the greater list of projects, the longer list, there were some projects specified up in the Pellisier Creek area in some of those areas. So again, they're identified as, again, another one of the impaired waters that should think about getting ahead of and providing some water quality treatment potentially through projects. Development case is another scenario. Through when we looked at the development code, there were some recommendations, some enhancements of some things that can be looked at, to kind of curb the, how should I say, historic impact of development. And I will qualify that there's good development, there's bad development. Hopefully everybody recognizes that. But, and we're doing a better job these days, but still you want to make sure. So there's a lot of things such as new stormwater practices, green infrastructure, low impact development type of practices that can be promoted by code that can work with the larger facilities on a small basis to be able to, each kind of chip away at that need to improve water quality before it gets in the in the receiving water bodies. So it's rarely that there's ever a one thing that can be done and then water quality is taken care of. A lot of times it is maybe some big thing or two, but then a lot of little things that are a part of the picture. So, but for future development, being smart about how development happens, being aware of those impaired waters as well. Now, I'm elaborating a little bit more on this, but there are some other counties in Florida that have recognized the struggle they have with their impaired waters and making things better, and have actually instituted some stormwater programs or manuals, requirements that go a little bit above and beyond what the state or water management district require to, say, provide more water quality treatment, recognizing they need to almost kind of mitigate for the past, so to speak. Those kind of things can be a challenge to implement because you're from a development standpoint, but there is precedent of people trying to go the extra mile to do that for new development.
Yeah, I think, and as you mentioned, lots of different techniques, one of them being the buffers that are critical to those wetland edges and stuff, and looking at the high quality ones and maybe having a hierarchy of buffers and looking at some other ways to protect those waters. Do you talk about things that we can do legislatively, not just requesting funds, but are there policy statements or things that we can do as a legislative body to help the state? And maybe do you talk about potential policies that, from a statewide perspective, that can help water quality that we could be advocates for?
Yeah, and as part of the plan, we spend time. There's a section on best management practices, which borrows a lot from state criteria, from other industry standard things, which really focuses in on what are some enhancements, some things you can do, maybe even some policy changes to implement more water quality enhanced or friendly practices, which really goes in line as well, because you may be aware that the state has been promulgating a new statewide stormwater quality rule. It was, I'm going to make sure I get the terminology right, it was adopted, but it still has to get legislative approval, which is maybe the next legislative session in 2024. And that will bring a lot of, clarity to that kind of concurrency between needs. But there's a lot of good things going on in Florida, and a degree of I think what you're kind of getting at is how can you all help locally to mirror, to promote some of those aspects as well. And I think there's some opportunities, there's some information in the master plan that will help provide staff some ideas.
All right, I think that's it for now.
Anything else? Don? Nothing? Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, it's good.
You want to finish up?
Really appreciate your time today so that
And
we could share this information.
This link that you've got, we can go read the whole plan?
We have a draft report that they submitted this morning. We need to just kind of take a look at it, but it will be available to everyone here probably within a week or so. The link that's in this document is going to be updating on our website what some of the details of the presentation, the comment form that we've provided for the public to get their feedback from.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what this link is.
That's right.
Mr.
And
Chairman,
also, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, what I'd like to say is, we don't want to put you on the spot and get all your recommendations and questions right at this moment. And then I expect that there will be some follow-up from you all for us.
So we need to read it.
Pardon?
We need to read it.
Okay.
We can't make recommendations.
No, that's fine.
Until
No,
we've read it.
I mean questions, following this workshop. If you have
Yeah.
anything that's really not clear, just feel free to route that through our department, and we'll get some answers back to you, and then get the additional information over to you for your
Okay.
review.
Ms. Sullivan?
Yeah, I think you, Mr. Chairman, you mentioned this. We are updating our comprehensive plan right now
Right.
in LDC, so it seems to me it'd be crazy not to incorporate the points from this in that, and not have to go back and change it later. So
What
I
we
guess
don't
that
want to,
process-
we don't want to see in your document
Yeah.
a complaint about our comprehensive plan. If you've got a problem with our fix it now, because they're rewriting it now. So, Anything else? Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll now open it up to public comment. Anybody wishing to discuss this presentation on the Flagler County Stormwater Master Plan, the mic is now open. Please come forward, state your name, and direct your comments to the chair. Seeing no one come forward, I'll close public comment.
Got one.
Whoop. You got to be quick,
I know, sorry.
because I'm
I
quick.
did
Over here.
Over here.
lunges
Microphone.
yesterday, so my quads are a little sore. Okay, Kate Comiskey, Sea Colony, HOA. I'm a board member. Thank you for the presentation. Chairman, I would like to direct my question to you, but if you would, then relay that to the consultants. And that is, what's the criteria that was used in order to assign rankings? How did they determine how they ranked their projects? Thank you.
Richard, do you want to do that, or? We'll get an answer for you.
So as part of the ranking criteria, we look at several things. We look at the depending on the type of project, whether it's a flooding or water quality, we look at the perceived benefit. We look at the influence of that project. In other words, how much area of flooding does it resolve, or water quality does it treat? We look at other criteria, implementation criteria, such as even some of the things we talked about as far as constructability, overall cost, all factor into a ranking. But a lot of it really comes down to the benefit the project will provide, the kind of bang for the buck, so to speak. So, for example, on a water quality project, that bang for the buck is generally the amount of, say, nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. That's key water quality parameters that this project reduces per the cost that is spent on the project. For flooding, a lot of times it's focused on an improvement of level of service. For example, you have this many numbers of infrastructure or pipes or inlets or facilities that are deficient, and this project can fix, some certain number of them or all of them, and that's a degree of success or improvement in level of service, and that all factors into the kind of ranking of the projects. Now, I will say with that, some of the ranking is fairly close, and then there's also input from what we've heard from the public as well, and from staff as well, as where the problems they have seen are. For example, we as engineers, as I mentioned, one of the tools we use is some of these computer models. Well, you can run models and do things all day, but you also want to have some real-world observation of those issues as well. So we generally try not to go by just if the model is the only thing that says there's a problem going by. So long story short, multiple factors that work into the ranking, but a lot of it comes down to the cost benefit for either flooding or water quality.
I noticed your top, your top 4 or 5 were solving flooding issues, which I was glad to see, because we have a number of problems with flooding in the area.
Yes, and generally, because that's what people see the most of, and the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, because the last thing you want is flooded streets that make it difficult for people to get in and out of their properties, or emergency vehicles, or, of course, houses flooding and that type of thing. So.
Thank you. Anybody else wish to comment? Last chance. We'll close public comment and bring it back to the board. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
We're adjourned. Thank you. Thank you all. It's a good presentation. Appreciate it. But again, if you want our input, let us read it.